"Here is the man." When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he's claimed to be the Son of God." Now when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. He entered his headquarters again and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you know that I have power to release you and power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. Pilate said to the Jews, "Here is your king." They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor." Then Pilate handed Jesus over to them to be crucified. So may God add a blessing to the reading of God's word. So what I want to just talk to you about for a moment this morning is the idea or understanding of hidden in plain sight. Hidden in plain sight. Now, for me, I can remember some of the more famous or well-known people in the world who I've run into. In fact, one of the first that I met was this gentleman right here. Go down the slide, please. You know who that is? Don King. Don King and I shared a flight from Philadelphia to Cleveland, Ohio. He was on my flight. I wasn't on his. The boxing promoter who actually is from Cleveland originally, where he hails from. So I remember the time that I met Don King. I'm not sure Don King remembers the time that he met me. Then a few years later, while at Rockefeller Center, going through, I met this gentleman right here. Wait, I'm sorry, not that one. I met Mike Myers, but not that Mike Myers. Thank God. I met Michael Myers, who was then working for Saturday Night Live and doing Wayne's World. I met him while I was again in New York. And then sometime later, I was actually in New York at Times Square with a group of youth from Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Detroit, Michigan. We were on a summer youth program staff training trip in New York, and we were hanging out in Times Square. And I have to admit, I did not recognize him. One of the kids did, but afterwards, we actually found we ran into Stone Cold Steve Austin. Any wrestling fans out there? There's got to be a couple of us in the house. Stone Cold was one of my favorite wrestlers, were his lines and what he did. And I have to tell you again that he's about 6'1", maybe. Perhaps he doesn't really stand out like you would think a wrestler would. He was actually standing in Times Square waiting to catch a cab. And one of the kids recognized him. He had a hat on and sunglasses, and so we stopped. And I have to tell you, I know his wrestling persona is one who would not be very kind and gentle, but he was so good with these young folks and signed all autographs and took pictures, and definitely just seemed to be at least we caught him on a good day. But it's amazing that once we acknowledged him and recognized him, suddenly a whole crowd had gathered around him. And so while we were watching this phenomenon take place, how someone who could be so anonymous one moment and become so important the next, we decided ourselves to do a little experiment. And with us that day in this group of teenagers, there was probably about 13 teenagers I recollect. There was a young man named Ralph Davis. Now, Ralph Davis was Ralph Davis. What can I say? He was Ralph Davis. He was a decent student in school, average height, looked like as any teenager, if you would. We had decided we were going to make Ralph Davis somebody. And so we told Ralph Davis to go into the hotel lobby, the hotel there, and once he came out, that everyone else would fall out when they saw him. So sure enough, Ralph went into the hotel and stayed in the lobby for a few moments, and then he walked out. And when Ralph Davis walked out of the hotel onto Broadway, onto Times Square, the kids started screaming, "Ralph Davis! It's Ralph Davis! Ralph Davis!" And the girls were screaming, the guys were, "Hey, Ralph Davis! Ralph Davis!" And they all went running up to Ralph Davis. And they started taking his picture and getting his autograph. Well, sure enough, as these kids were doing it, all of a sudden, this whole crowd of passerbys all of a sudden came running up. And I remember one guy even looked at me and was like, "Who's that? Who's that?" And I said, That's Ralph Davis." "It is? That's Ralph, honey, that's Ralph Davis." And you would be amazed how many people asked Ralph Davis, and no disrespect to Ralph Davis, but all these people took home autographs of Ralph Davis. And actually, Ralph Davis got a little ego himself, because we had to keep reminding him, "You're Ralph Davis." Again, hidden or hiding in plain sight. That's what today's story is for us in many ways, this gospel reading of these two leaders, if you would. These two leaders of two different kingdoms who collide on the stage together. Where you have the one who is so easily recognizable, the one who stands as the governor of Judea, who has the title of being the prefect, who has at his disposal so much power in Roman soldiers and weaponry, and has so much wealth behind him. In fact, go down the slide for me, please, where it's Pilate and it's Jesus. And Jesus is also in front of Pilate, but Jesus, who is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Jesus, who is the great I am, the Word in the flesh, the resurrection and the life, the way, the truth, and the life, is standing in front of someone filled with so much worldly power that he fails to recognize who's standing before him, unable to see just who Jesus is. And how you have the gospel telling us they went back and forth in a conversation throughout this whole story. And how often you will see that Pilate's eyes become impaired to see Jesus for who he is because of all the information that was going in his ears. What we read last week and continuing this week was there was this crowd. And don't you know it's so easy to just follow the crowd? How the crowd is calling for the crucifixion of this one named Jesus. How the crowd is in Pilate's ears, reminding him of his own responsibilities as governor of what he's supposed to do. How the crowd is whipped into a frenzy, clamoring for the release of a bandit named Barabbas, who they have DNA evidence on, that he was a murderer. How the crowd is bloodthirsty and calling for Jesus to be the one to be put on the cross. That John's gospel tells us how again Pilate took Jesus and had him beaten. And the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And they dressed him in a purple robe. And they kept coming up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," striking him on the face. Pilate went out again to say to them, to say to the crowd, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." It's the crowd. It's the crowd that is calling for the death of Jesus in this moment. And how much easier is in life to just go with the flow? How much easier is in life to just follow the crowd and don't fight against what everybody else is calling to be done or for you to do? How easy it is to just make no waves, to cause no fuss. It's just easier if we all just go along so we all can just get along. Last week, of course, we saw with Peter himself, who wasn't willing to stand when they said, "I saw you with him." I don't know him. Because he knows that if he took that stand in that moment, what could have possibly happened to him? And it goes back and forth even here with Pilate also. He seems to be struggling somehow. You know, throughout John's gospel, Pontius Pilate goes out to the crowd and into Jesus. Out to the crowd and back to Jesus. It's almost like he's hemming and hawing about what should I do? Because he's lost in that moment of knowing exactly what do I do in what is here now. In fact, Pontius Pilate struggled with this moment. Matthew's gospel even tells us that his wife had a dream. And in the dream, she was told to tell her husband, have nothing to do with this man. In Jesus Christ Superstar, we were talking about this morning, that musical that's so powerful, that rock musical from early 70s. There's an incredible verse in the song Pilate sings where Pilate says he himself had a dream about a certain Galilean, a most pathetic man, the kind you often don't see, the hunted, haunted kind. So it was something about Jesus in Pilate's presence that made him really desire to release him. But he found he just couldn't do that because, again, there was the crowd. There was the crowd that continued to ask for Jesus to be crucified. And Pilate continues to go back and forth. You can envision what he must have been feeling himself, caught in the middle. Of course, we see that he actually has Jesus taken and beaten or flogged. And it's interesting because they would beat someone in Roman times in this manner. He was probably struck, we believe, 39 times with a whip. They do this for one of two reasons. They flog you as a chastisement so they can release you, or they beat you so they can weaken you so you'll be ready to be crucified. Now, perhaps Pilate was hoping that the beating would be enough. But others may have interpreted that beating as a moment to prepare Jesus for a crucifixion that would then await him. And the soldiers, it's ironic because the soldiers dressed him in a purple robe and put a crown of thorns on him in a mocking way to make him king. But in a way, they're revealing who he actually is. Now, I just want you to know today also that the biblical story about Pilate, about Pontius Pilate, which, let me just add something real quick. His name is Pontius Pilate. Everybody say his last name is Pilate. That is not his occupation. We actually had a young lady Friday night in confirmation class. We were giving out different parts to read. And so I was asking the kids, do you know who you are? And one kid narrator, yeah, I'm reading, I'm narrator tell this story. Someone's Jesus, yeah, I'm Son of God. And someone was Peter, yeah, I denied. And someone's church leader, I have crucified. And someone was Pontius Pilate. And they said, yeah, I'm the pilot. You know, I'm flying the plane. It's his last day, right? He's not the pilot. Pontius Pilate, what we know from history, what we know from the historical record, is Pontius Pilate became the governor, the prefect of the Judean countryside, the area that included Israel, around the year 26 BCE, about 7 years before the day when Jesus would stand before him. What we know about Pilate from history is Pilate was a ruthless individual, cold-hearted in so many ways. In fact, Pontius Pilate's father was a very well-known soldier who fought for the Roman government. And he was a well-known mercenary and one who was trained to kill. His son Pontius actually didn't go into military service as a soldier. He went into military service as an administrator. So he never saw action as a soldier, but he learned how to command soldiers. And when he first arrived into Jerusalem, we're told that Pontius Pilate actually entered into the Jewish temple with banners and flags that had Emperor Caesar's image on it. And he left the banners in the temple, which, if you know anything about Jewish law, the Ten Commandments, number 2 is you shall not make any graven images. There should be no images in the temple. Pilate knew what the Jewish people didn't want, so that's exactly what he did. And when there was a revolt, when there was an insurrection against what he did, Pilate had thousands of people killed. In fact, we often learn about the crucifixion of Jesus. We don't realize that there were thousands and thousands of people crucified, of Jews crucified. That's one of the reasons the place Jesus was crucified was called Golgotha, the place of the skull, because there were thousands of skulls that were already there. Pilate had no problem killing somebody who wasn't Roman. Now, if you were a Roman citizen, you got different kind of treatment. But if you were non-Roman, like Jesus, Pilate did not mind doing whatever he had to do. And we learned throughout this time also that Pilate was very good friends with a certain man named Caiaphas, who was also the high priest over the temple. In fact, you couldn't be high priest in Jerusalem unless Rome said you could be priest. And so you had Rome on one side with Pilate, and Jerusalem, the temple, on the other side with Caiaphas. And the two had a very unhealthy tryst, if you would, in how they combined powers to take care of anybody who got in their way. So here is Jesus standing before Pilate. And there's something that's happening that makes Pilate want to pass on this crucifixion. There was something in this moment that made him want to, but he just felt like he what? He couldn't. There was too much pressure going on from all those around, reminding Pilate that your job is to protect the empire. Because this Jesus is a threat to the emperor. See, one of the things I hope that in our own walk of faith, that we can understand that's really happening here with Jesus, and even in our own walk of faith, is we have to be able to acknowledge that life is complicated. Amen? And when you add faith to life, a faith life is even more complicated. Y'all with me? I mean, I think sometimes we want to present it too easy, where you just have to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, give your heart to Christ, and see you later. You're good to go. But life is so much more complicated than that, as we're called to walk through. Because what's happening here in this story happens in you and I every day. There is a clash of the titans, if you would. There's a clash of two kingdoms taking place right before our eyes. Go down the slide, please. Right here on this scene, this trial, it's on your bulletin as well, you have the kingdom in the middle. That is the Roman Empire, the most powerful empire in the world at this time. And to your left, you have another kingdom. You have another king. A kingdom that God is establishing that has different understandings than the kingdom that Pilate represents. Are y'all with me so far? See, Pilate is one who, again, is reminded that he is representing the emperor. And Pilate is a ruler, a governor of a kingdom of this world. And it's a kingdom that's founded on violence. It's a kingdom that's backed up with power. It's a kingdom that is looking. In fact, you know what Pilate's main job was? All Rome wanted Pilate to do is to make sure he got all the tax revenue that he could out of Jerusalem back to Rome again. And whatever else he had to do to keep the peace, Pilate be our guest. And so the kingdom that Pilate represented was this kingdom that was about exploitation and division and founded on retribution. Eye for what? Eye, tooth for tooth. That you do to me, we do back to you. And trust me, Rome would do to you over and over again. And then there stands Jesus, a different kind of king, wearing a crown of thorns and a purple robe. A kingdom that Pilate is trying to understand when he says, where are you from? A kingdom founded not on fear, like Pilate, but a kingdom founded on love. A kingdom that has no borders, no bounds to it. A kingdom based on the equality of all God's children. A kingdom that wasn't tribal in nature, but saw the big picture of God's creation. A kingdom that Jesus founded that would be filled with forgiveness and not retribution. In fact, even my son Zachary, I was driving him to his appointment last week for his neurologist down at Johns Hopkins, and I was just telling Kim and Linda, I love to listen to Jesus Christ Superstar this time of year on my iPod in the car. And you all familiar with Jesus Christ Superstar? Andrew Lloyd Webber? And you know, they have all the different people singing in different parts. And you have, of course, Jesus, and you have Judas, and you have Peter, and you have the high priests. And so Jack's always asking me, Daddy, who's singing? Who's this singing now? And so I'm driving, Zach, that's Judas. Oh, he's bad? Is he bad, Daddy? He's complicated, Zach. He does a bad thing, yes. Daddy, who's that singing now? That's Peter. Is he bad? Zach, he's complicated. Okay, Peter makes a mistake, he's good or bad. Daddy, who's that? That's Jesus. Oh, he's good, Daddy, right? Jesus good. Yeah, Jesus good. Oh, who's that, Daddy? That's the chief priest. Oh, Daddy, they're bad? Well, they're the ones that killed Jesus. They're the ones that get him killed and hung on the cross. Jesus died? Yeah, Zach, Jesus died on the cross. Dad, he died? Yeah, Zach, but he came back, he rose from the dead 3 days later. He did? Yeah, he rose. That's Easter. He rose. What did he do after he rose from the dead? Well, he came back to Zach to let us know what God has done, that God's given him all power. Did he go back and punch them in the face? The people who... That's what he asked me. I said, no, Zach, Jesus didn't go back and punch them in the face. Zach said, I would have. Because isn't that, again, the way of the world? The kingdom of the world? But see, again, Jesus is saying there's a different kingdom. There's a different way that God is calling. That is not what we learn in the world. And there's a different thing than the cross, as the cross itself is used here as this instrument of fear and an instrument of torture. The cross in Rome's hands is a place where you go to die, where you are suffered for standing up for what is right, where you are taken to is the cross when it's in the world's hands. But God takes the cross and changes it and transforms it as a place of love and a place where God meets us in the midst of suffering and hardship and even death. That's the kingdom of God. that the king in his crown of thorns is hung. That's what John is trying to show us. But here's the dilemma I hope we acknowledge. You and I live in both kingdoms. And both kingdoms live in us. See, what often happens is we want to believe that somehow those two things just work in harmony with each other all the time. And they don't. There are decisions and choices we make every day that are either going to be rewarded by the world and taught this is how we live, or ones that are led by God. Every moment, those choices. I mean, it's so easy for us to look at Pilate and judge him. Because really what's happening in this whole moment is it's not Jesus who's being judged. Actually, it's Pilate. It's the values of the world that are judged on the cross for us to see. And that's what's alive in you and I each and every day. That's the reality that we live with each and every day. Because so often we don't recognize the fact that God is right with us. That God is hiding in plain sight. That Christ is here, as we talked about last Sunday. The cross is still here in places of great suffering, in places of hardship and exploitation. That's where the cross is. Christ is with us now. The King is still here. But so often we fail to recognize his presence and to see where he is with us. So I told you about who I recognized in my life, some of the famous people, if you would. But I want to close the story today of having my grandparents. My grandfather, who's now deceased, almost 14 years. And my grandmother just died back in early February at 100 years old. They were quite a couple. Let me just say that. They were the yin and yang of the world. In fact, I never quite understood not just how they met, but how they stayed married for 60-some years. My grandfather was very gruff, very loud, he worked in a steel mill outside Pittsburgh for 35 years, and he had that mentality, if you would. My grandmother was just as sweet potato pie. She was just so kind and caring. That was Mary, and Bob would just tell you whatever he thought and didn't care how you took it, especially if he had a beer, right? So, my grandparents were in an airport. I think they actually were down in Florida. And because they weren't as mobile as they used to be, they used to take a cart from gate to gate, right? And so they're sitting on this cart. And well, let me just see, go down the slide, please. I don't know, do you recognize? Barbara got it. So this gentleman right there is sitting in the cart in front of them. My grandparents are facing backwards. Also, my grandfather goes, "Gilligan!" And my grandma says, "Stop it, Bob." And he says, "Gilligan!" And my grandma's like, "Bob, stop." He says, "Oh, Mary, Gilligan!" And this guy turns around and he says, "Yes." And my grandfather said, "I knew you were Gilligan." And it was. It was this guy. Go down the slide. It was Bob Denver. It was Gilligan. And my grandfather says to Gilligan, "You were the best actor ever on TV." He said, "I mean it. You carried that show every episode. You were the star." And my grandma says, "Bob, that's why they called it Gilligan's Island." But I'll never forget how my grandmother always would say that she never recognized that she was sharing a cart with Gilligan. But my grandfather saw who was there with them, who was in the cart. So the question is, are you and I able to see Christ with us, to see the kingdom of heaven that is present among us all the time, and the kingdom of heaven that God has placed in us as we go through the world? And as we face the choices, will you and I choose to be resident citizens of the kingdom of heaven, or simply are we going to reside in the world? Because you can see what the cross happens at the cross when God's kingdom grabs hold of it as we gather in a couple weeks. Amen? Amen. Let's give God a hand clap of praise.